The bright studio lights blazed as the cameras rolled, capturing every detail of the much-anticipated interview. It was a high-stakes moment for both parties involved. J.D. Vance, the newly inaugurated Vice President of the United States, stepped onto the set with quiet confidence, his posture relaxed yet commanding. He was no stranger to difficult conversations, having navigated both the battlegrounds of war as a Marine and the treacherous waters of Washington politics. However, tonight he was entering a different kind of battlefield. A war of words, a duel of ideologies. Across from him sat Ethan Caldwell, the seasoned journalist known for his sharp, incisive questioning and unapologetic skepticism toward conservative figures. With decades of experience in political broadcasting, Caldwell had built a reputation for his aggressive interview style, often leaving his guests flustered and on the defensive. His loyal audience expected nothing less than a spectacle, a verbal takedown of the vice president. Yet as Vance took his seat, there was something in his composed demeanor that suggested he had come prepared. The tension in the air was almost palpable. The usual pre-show small talk was perfunctory, mechanical. Caldwell's handshake firm but cold, his smile tight and calculated. In contrast, Vance exuded the ease of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. Behind the cameras, the production team exchanged knowing glances. They had witnessed Caldwell dismantle politicians before, and they expected tonight to be no different. But there was something different. Caldwell, despite his usual air of control, gripped his interview notes a little too tightly. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, researching every word Vance had ever spoken, every article he had written. He was convinced that he had the perfect strategy to corner him, to expose contradictions, to force an admission of political opportunism. Yet, as the countdown to live broadcast began, a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. Vance was no ordinary guest. He was a man who had built his career on resilience, someone who thrived under pressure. As the camera's red light blinked on, signaling the start of the broadcast, Caldwell leaned forward with a practiced smile, his voice smooth yet laced with an unspoken challenge. "Mr. Vice President," he began, "let's talk about your remarkable journey, one that some might call a complete reversal of principles." Vance smiled, steady and unshaken. The game had begun. Ethan Caldwell leaned forward, his polished demeanor exuding confidence. He had prepared for this moment meticulously, reviewing every statement, every past criticism J.D. Vance had made about Donald Trump. Now, live on national television, he was ready to expose what he saw as the vice president's greatest contradiction. "Mr. Vice President," Caldwell began, his voice smooth, yet laced with the sharp edge of challenge, "not long ago you were one of President Trump's most vocal critics. You called him unfit for office, even questioned his leadership. And yet, here you are, his second in command. Some might call that growth, but others," he let the words hang, as if savoring the tension, "others might call it political convenience." A murmur rippled through the audience. The question was a direct attack, meant to put Vance on the defensive. Caldwell sat back, watching for signs of discomfort. But there were none. Vance met his gaze, composed and unwavering. He had anticipated this. He knew the media had fixated on this narrative, branding him a turncoat, a man who had abandoned his principles for power. But that wasn't the truth. "You know, Ethan," Vance said, his tone measured, "I'm glad you brought that up, because this isn't just about me, it's about something much bigger. The ability to grow, to learn." He leaned slightly forward. "You see, in America, we don't mock people for changing their minds when they see new evidence. We respect it." Caldwell's smirk faltered for a brief moment. "When I criticized President Trump," Vance continued, "I was speaking from a limited perspective. Like many, I had doubts. But then I did what I don't see enough of in the media. I paid attention. I saw his policies lift families out of poverty, bring back jobs, and restore a voice to people who had been ignored for decades. And I had a choice: cling to my original stance out of pride, or acknowledge that I had been wrong." He let the words settle before delivering his next line. "I chose truth over ego. The studio was silent. Even those who disagreed with Vance had to admit he wasn't flustered, he wasn't scrambling, he was in control. Caldwell, however, was determined to reclaim the upper hand. "So what you're saying," he pressed, "is that your change of heart had nothing to do with political ambition? That it's pure coincidence you now hold one of the most powerful offices in the country?" His voice carried a hint of derision. Vance smiled, sensing the attempt to twist his words. "Let me ask you something, Ethan," he countered, his voice calm. "Have you ever changed your mind about something important? Have you ever believed in something, only to later realize you didn't have the full picture?" Caldwell's eyes flickered with hesitation, just for a second, but Vance caught it. So did the audience. "We're here to talk about your record, Mr. Vice President," Caldwell shot back quickly. "But we're also here to talk about integrity, aren't we?" Vance replied smoothly, "Because integrity isn't about never changing your mind. It's about having the courage to admit when you've learned something new." A ripple of applause broke out. Caldwell's jaw tightened. "You call it political convenience," Vance continued, his voice steady. "I call it the ability to recognize when a leader is getting results. When I saw President Trump's policies working, I didn't double down on my past skepticism just to save face. I adjusted my views because the facts demanded it." Caldwell wasn't ready to back down. "So you're saying your critics should just ignore your past statements, pretend they never happened?" "Not at all," Vance replied evenly. "I stand by what I said at the time, because that was what I believed then. But you know what takes more character than sticking to a position just for the sake of appearances? Admitting when new facts change your perspective." The audience murmured again, this time more in thought than reaction. Caldwell glanced at his notes, flipping through his prepared questions. He had expected Vance to dodge, to deflect, maybe even to grow defensive. Instead, the vice president had turned the conversation into a debate on growth, on wisdom, on the very nature of leadership itself. And worse, he was winning. Vance leaned back slightly, his expression composed. "You see, the real political opportunists aren't the ones who change their minds when they see truth firsthand. They're the ones who refuse to, even when it's staring them right in the face." The audience erupted in applause. Caldwell clenched his jaw. He had walked into this interview expecting to corner J.D. Vance. Instead, he was the one struggling to keep control. Ethan Caldwell adjusted his tie, his expression sharpening as he prepared his next attack. He had lost ground in the previous exchange, but he wasn't finished. If there was one topic that could put a conservative on the defensive, it was faith in politics. "Mr. Vice President," Caldwell began, his tone carrying an air of controlled skepticism, "you recently spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast, where you referenced divine guidance in leadership. Many Americans believe faith is a personal matter, not something that should influence government decisions. Don't you think mixing religion and politics is a dangerous precedent?" The audience tensed. The question wasn't just controversial, it was designed to put Vance in a difficult position. If he defended faith in leadership, he risked alienating secular viewers. If he backed down, he risked looking weak in the eyes of those who shared his beliefs. But J.D. Vance didn't flinch. He met Caldwell's gaze head-on, his voice calm and steady. "Ethan, let's be precise about what I said," he replied. "I didn't say we should establish a state religion. I said that moral guidance is essential in leadership. Something our founding fathers understood. They weren't afraid of faith, they were afraid of tyranny." A murmur ran through the crowd. Caldwell's smirk wavered slightly, but he recovered. "Surely," Caldwell countered, "in a diverse society, not everyone shares the same religious convictions. How do you respond to those who feel excluded by such rhetoric?" Vance leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding. "Ethan, I served in the Marine Corps, and do you know what I never once heard? A single complaint about the presence of a chaplain, not from believers, not from atheists, because when you're preparing for battle, when you're facing life and death, even the skeptics understand that there's something greater than ourselves." The air in the studio grew heavier. Caldwell blinked as if momentarily thrown off by the answer. Vance let the silence linger before pressing forward. Faith isn't about exclusion, it's about foundation. It's about the moral compass that guides us, whether we sit in a church pew or not. Our greatest leaders, Washington, Lincoln, Reagan, spoke openly about faith. So tell me, Ethan, why is it that when I do the same, suddenly it's controversial? Caldwell's expression stiffened. He wasn't used to being on the defensive. Because, Mr. Vice President, Caldwell said, pushing back, some might argue that your public emphasis on faith seems to align conveniently with your rise in politics. Isn't it fair to ask if this is just election season Christianity? A few gasps echoed from the audience. Caldwell had gone for the jugular. He expected Vance to bristle, to stumble. But he didn't. Instead, Vance smiled. Not out of amusement, but out of a quiet, unshakable certainty. You're asking about timing, he said, shaking his head slightly. Ethan, I have been attending the same church since before I entered politics. Would you like to question my grandmother's faith, too? The woman who taught me to pray before every meal, even when we had barely anything to eat? Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. He had underestimated the power of that response. Vance continued, his voice firm. You can question my policies, you can disagree with my decisions, but when you suggest that my faith is nothing more than political theater, you're not just attacking me, you're attacking every American who holds their faith dear. A few audience members clapped, others nodded. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. And since we're talking about timing, Vance added, his tone sharpening, let's talk about yours, because last month you ran an entire segment questioning whether traditional values were outdated. You said that those who believe in them are stuck in the past. Do you really believe that, Ethan? That millions of Americans who go to church, who believe in family, who love their country are just relics of a bygone era? Caldwell's jaw tightened. The power dynamic had completely shifted. A heavy silence filled the studio. Then, suddenly, applause. Louder this time, stronger. Caldwell glanced at his producer, who was frantically signaling him to move on. The planned ambush had backfired spectacularly, and J.D. Vance knew it. Ethan Caldwell sat back in his chair, forcing a composed smile as the audience's applause faded. He had lost ground on the faith question, but there was another angle, one that he was certain would strike a nerve. It was time to challenge J.D. Vance's authenticity. Mr. Vice President, Caldwell began, his tone casual but his words razor-sharp, you often speak about your working-class roots, about growing up in a struggling town in Ohio. But now you sit in the halls of power, wearing tailored suits, traveling in motorcades. Some might say you've forgotten where you came from. The audience hushed. It was a familiar narrative, one that had been used against many politicians before, the accusation that success had made a man disconnect from the people who shaped him. Vance, however, did not blink. He had been expecting this. That's an interesting take, Ethan, he said, his voice steady. Because where I come from, we don't judge a man by his suit. We judge him by his character. A murmur ran through the crowd. Caldwell's smirk barely faltered. He was ready for that response. But isn't it fair, Caldwell pressed, to ask whether you can still relate to the struggles of the people you once wrote about? After all, you now walk the corridors of Washington, not the streets of Middletown. Vance's expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened. Let me ask you something, Ethan. Have you ever missed a meal because there wasn't enough food in the house? Have you ever watched someone you love work themselves to the bone just to keep the lights on? Caldwell opened his mouth, but Vance didn't give him the chance to answer. You see, I don't have to prove where I come from, he continued, his voice carrying the weight of experience. I lived it. I was raised by a woman who worked harder than anyone I've ever known, and the struggles of people like her, the struggles of the working class, didn't disappear the moment I put on a suit. A few audience members nodded, some even clapped quietly. Caldwell shifted, but he wasn't backing down. Yet here you are, he countered, defending a billionaire president while standing on a stage far removed from those working-class streets. Don't you see the irony? Vance let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You know what I see, Ethan? I see someone who thinks an expensive suit changes a man's values. But let me tell you something. My grandmother didn't raise me to be ashamed of success. The audience reacted. Some clapped, others murmured. Caldwell's grip tightened on his note cards. The truth is, Vance continued, leaning forward slightly, success isn't the problem. The problem is when people in power forget who they're supposed to serve. I didn't come to Washington to join the club. I came to fight for the people I grew up with. Caldwell saw an opening. But isn't that exactly what people in Washington always say? He pushed. That they're different? That they're fighting for the little guy? How can Americans trust that you mean it? Vance's expression darkened slightly. Because I've lived it, he said simply. I know what it's like to be counted out. I know what it's like to be told that where you come from defines where you're going. And I know that the people who are still struggling today don't need another politician who talks about their pain from a distance. They need someone who actually understands it. A woman in the front row nodded emphatically, whispering to the person next to her. You want to talk about irony, Vance continued, his tone sharpening. The real irony is that the same people who attacked me for standing with Trump are the ones who have spent years ignoring the very communities he helped. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. The conversation was slipping from his control again. You call it irony, Caldwell shot back. Some would call it political ambition. Some would say you saw an opportunity and took it. Vance smiled, but there was steel behind it. You know what takes more character than sticking to an old opinion just to save face? Admitting when you were wrong. Silence. Then, applause. Caldwell clenched his jaw. He had framed the question to make Vance look like a man who had abandoned his past. Instead, he had given him an opening to prove he had never left it behind. Ethan Caldwell exhaled slowly, realizing his carefully planned ambush had unraveled. Every attempt to corner J.D. Vance had only strengthened the vice president's position. But Caldwell had one last card to play. So, Mr. Vice President, Caldwell said, his voice carrying an air of forced composure, you've defended your loyalty to President Trump, you've defended your faith, you've defended your working-class roots, but at the end of the day, aren't you just another politician asking Americans to trust you? Vance smiled. Not a smirk, not a calculated expression, but a look of quiet confidence. He had spent his life proving himself to those who doubted him. This moment was no different. No, Ethan, he said calmly. I'm not asking Americans to trust me because of my title. I'm asking them to judge me by my actions. The audience stilled. Caldwell pressed his lips together, sensing the inevitable. Washington is full of people who talk, Vance continued. People who tell working Americans what they want to hear, only to forget them the moment the cameras stop rolling. I didn't come here to join that club. I came here to fight for the people who raised me, the people politicians like you ignored for years. The room was silent. The tension, the back and forth, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was truth. Vance looked directly at the camera, speaking now to the millions watching at home. You see, they thought they could shame me for my faith. They thought they could mock my support for President Trump. They thought they could force me to apologize for believing in traditional values. But what they don't understand is, these aren't political positions. They're the principles that built America. Applause broke out across the studio. Caldwell sat frozen, his planned attack in ruins. Vance rose from his seat, straightened his tie, and faced the camera one last time. To every American who's ever been mocked for their beliefs, who's ever been told they're on the wrong side of history, stand strong. Because character isn't about pleasing critics, it's about standing firm in what you believe. The standing ovation shook the studio. Caldwell's voice was barely audible as he muttered, I think we're out of time. Yes, Vance agreed, smiling. Yes, we are. This wasn't just an interview. It was a battle of values, a clash of convictions, and a defining moment for millions watching. J.D. Vance didn't just defend his beliefs. He proved that integrity is about more than just words. It's about action, about standing firm when the world demands you bend. Now I turn it over to you. Do you believe in standing by your convictions even when faced with opposition? Drop a comment below and let your voice be heard. And if you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because faith, family, and freedom aren't just words. They're the foundation of America.